nuts to this.
Back in the spring of 1993, I found myself in a frenzy searching for every videotape I could find of the newfangled medium of Japanimation that I had recently discovered. My genius plan was to order them from the Blockbuster video store that I worked at so that I could rent them for free instead of shelling out $30 to $45 per tape, which would be almost doubled in today's currency due to inflation. My boss was a boss though, and he didn't really care that I was totally taking advantage of the mega corporation that we worked for, as he'd always be the first person to drop a bag of peanut M&Ms on the ground and then claim they were defective before pretending to throw them in the trash, but instead sheepishly devouring them. But I digress. I had become a fan of anime at the time due to only recently finding out that Robotech was actually made up of 3 unrelated Japanese series. Who knew, right? And I wanted to see more. I wanted all of the animes. Unfortunately, at this time in the life cycle of anime in America, there were very few companies releasing stuff for consumers, and a lot of the OVAs and movies, and no TV shows at this time, were dub only. Horribly dubbed only. I had already seen Fist of the North Star, Black Magic, and the last 4 episodes of Gunbuster since our Blockbuster store already had those in stock, but it wasn't until that spring of my senior year in high school that I got to first witness the life and times of the one known as
Vampire Hunter D.
The 1985 Vampire Hunter D movie was mind-blowing to my younger self. It was so different from anything else I had ever seen before. The tone of the film, the setting, the blood and the gore. I loved it all and pushed it on all my friends like a crackhead trying to share his love of illegal substances so that he wasn't alone in his addiction. I remember joining my college's cinematic club, the group responsible for deciding the daily movie shown at our Student Center movie theater, for the sole purpose of getting things like D and other early anime movies scheduled on the weekend midnight slots. D started a fire in me for anime that rages to this day like the never-ending wildfires that seem to constantly burn the West Coast to the ground. But then in 2001, by the time the next Vampire Hunter D movie came out, one Bloodlust, I had seen a lot more anime and really came to appreciate the larger budget, much improved character designs, and the infinitely more enjoyable storyline as compared to the first D flick. But then I thought that maybe I had just misremembered the original 1985 production and thought it'd be a good idea to revisit it. That was a bad mistake. The 1985 D movie, post-Bloodlust, really let me down, and since re-experiencing it back in 2001, I have seen it numerous times as my friends and I Mystery Science Theatered it over the years. My most recent time was with my wife last Monday. At this point in time, I consider the 85 Vampire Hunter D movie a straight-up comedy.
Plot.
Things start off in the far, far distant future of 12,090 AD. The Earth is a post-apocalyptic European Old West semi-Star Wars amalgamation, filled with humans just scraping by and doing their best to survive and farm the land, mutant monsters that roam the dark forests, and ancient noble vampire kings and their armies of werewolves, giants, and other wicked and bizarre creatures ruling the night. And so far so good, I admit. We meet the hot young Blod and... Blod? The fuck is Blod? We meet the hot young blonde and incredibly fit human Doris as she patrols the farmland that her dead parents left to her and her tween brother Dan one night. We watch as she sloppily kills a mutant dinosaur thing that was just eating some fruit off her fruit trees, and, well, later her horse, and then witness as she gets attacked by a werewolf who rips off her crucifix necklace, and then we bear testimony as an enormous vampire noble, one Count Magnus Lee, cool name, I'll give him that, appears in front of her and does his vampiric thing. You see, Magnus Lee has apparently been watching our plucky, tight little Doris like the creeper that he is, and he wants to make her his plaything for a few decades. Doris objects, but has no real say in the matter, it seems. Anyway, the next day we watch as Doris stands in the middle of the road into town for what feels like 30 minutes of reused animation, patiently waiting for a monster killer to come strolling her way. This must be a daily occurrence in the future because after just a morning of waiting, the mostly silent, but deadly, and pretty Vampire Hunter D,
oh, that's why they call it that,
meanders down the dusty path on his cyber horse and gets confronted by Doris. Doris thinks she's all that and a laser whip as she attacks Dee to test him to see if he's really a great monster hunter. Even though he never tells her that he's a hunter, he only ever just stares at her. She easily could have been attacking a random merchant or true blood dealer or something. Dee tosses Doris aside like a rag doll, and then she proceeds to beg for his forgiveness and beseeches him to take on her job of killing the 10,000-year-old uber-noble vampire lord Magnus Lee. She don't want none of that vampire thing all up in her lady business, that's for sure. Dee takes the job because he enjoys himself a good killing.
Oh boy, here I go killing again.
And then he goes into town with Doris and Dan as they attempt to buy some supplies for the farm. Dee then sees how Doris is shunned because she was marked by Magnus Lee and will shortly be turned into the Count's wife. And all the simple village folk, the people of the land, the common clay of the New West.
Morons.
Fear the old and powerful vampire lord, even though by shunning his soon-to-be wife, the villagers are probably pissing him off. But since when have humans ever thought anything through? It's after this that the fun game of Kidnap the Humans takes place. The rest of the movie is all about Magnus Lee sending his minions after Doris, her brother Dan, their doctor friend, or Dee. Whoa, Dee, Doris, Dan, and the doctor. That's a whole lot of
D.
Each time someone is kidnapped, Dee has to go and save the human in the biggest hurricane bloodbath that he can create. Oh, and did I mention that Dee is a Dhampir? Also known as a human-vampire hybrid, or daywalker, if you will. And so he is like super strong and has Wolverine's healing factor. Oh, and that he has a talking left hand, which must make some things very uncomfortable. I sure hope he's a righty wiper. After a few games of find the kidnapped human between Dee and Magnus Lee's daughter and some very 80s looking punk mutant who can bend space and time around him, Doris gets captured one more time, and Dee goes to Magnus Lee's techno-medieval castle to save her one more time. Then the wimpiest of showdowns occurs, wherein the ultra-powerful Magnus Lee gets quickly nailed to his own castle wall, where he comes to the hasty conclusion that Dee must be the ultimate vampire sire, that ultimate vampire being Dracula. He gets this idea by looking at a painting of the Drac that he just so happens to have hanging right above him as he bleeds out. And even though Dee and Dracula look nothing at all alike, must simply be vampire intuition. Then the castle crumbles all Castlevania-like, and Dee leaves Doris and Dan behind as he rides away on his horse, and they bellow after him just like Shane. Only not 1/100th as entertaining. The end.
Thoughts.
Vampire Hunter D is one of the most unintentionally hilarious things I've ever seen. I believe it was the first of its kind, animated gore-fest sci-fi western post-apocalyptic romance movie, but being first doesn't necessarily make one the best. It tries so hard to be badass, but it's actually pretty tame and boring, especially by today's standards. Yeah, the gory parts are still pretty great even 35 years later, but the pacing, character designs, forced titty shots, a bland and generic environment, and really lame and repetitive plot just turn it into a satire of a horror movie and not anything terrifying itself. Every scene in this movie dragged on for far too long, using repeated animation or simply displaying still frames to pad this whole thing out. We started keeping track of the number of scenes that just repeated the same animation for 10 to 30 seconds, which not an exaggeration, or that featured a still frame but someone's mouth flapping for 30 to 60 seconds. But this turned out to be futile, as it was the entire length of the movie. This flick is barely 80 minutes long, but if you took out the unnecessary still frames or repeated scenes, I swear it barely reached 40 to 50 minutes. Yeah, the budget is tiny, even compared to other anime at the time. Well, other OVAs and theatrical releases, I mean. TV animation of the time was just bare bones. But they really aren't that creative in finding unique and interesting ways around the shortcoming. Instead, they blast you in the face with their poor editing and design choices like a shotgun. And let's not forget the character designs of this thing. Gone are Yoshitaka Amano's beautiful and elegant designs from the original Vampire Hunter D novels that this anime is based on. And instead we get generic, boring, and very 80s characters like Doris, Dan, Ray, Lamaka Lee, and Dee himself. You didn't even realize that I replaced Dan with that kid from Fist of the North Star, did you? See, totally generic characters that shit all over Amino's amazing original designs. I can still remember being so impressed by Vampire Hunter D, though, when I first saw it, but age and future comparisons have not been kind to it. Take, for instance, the 2001 flick Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. It got everything right that the 1985 movie failed miserably at. It's beyond atmospheric, the characters are more than two-dimensional cardboard cutouts, the character designs are gorgeous and still Amino-fied, and the plot isn't your basic capture the damsel, free the damsel, capture the little brother of the damsel, free the little brother of the damsel, capture the damsel again, free the damsel again narratives. It's interesting and fun to watch. The 1985 movie was just lazy, sloppily directed, and mundanely scripted. The 1985 Vampire Hunter D movie is indeed
Forgotten garbage.
that you should never have to think about again. Go watch Bloodlust, though.